Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. I found myself musing lately as I've been doing my ancestral healing intensive and working on people's lineages, whether I would argue that we're more impacted by our past life experiences or our ancestral lineage. And so I want to spend a little bit of time just exploring this question from the point of view of my 25 years of experience. I really love the richness of all the data points that I have of having done a great deal of both ancestral work and past life healing for a lot of different people in a lot of different circumstances. And of course, I want to include the caveats of the demographic that I don't tend to see and how mileage, of course, varies from one individual to another. But I think it's just sort of interesting to look at these questions when you're exploring meaning about the experiences that you have, the triggers that you have, the areas that are more complicated for you, the areas that you have a lot of skill and elegance and ability. And for some people, their experience is very, very anchored in this lifetime, so you can really get at what's going on for someone, at least in the top levels that the guides are indicating are most important for healing. And for other people, really to make sense of their experience, the guides really look at the arc of multiple lifetimes. And there are things that are having a significant impact, not always in a negative way, but in a way that having ancestors who had a lot of really different experiences may impact us. So our lineage going back and how humans were before, both in past lives and ancestors, and the biological configuration of being adapted as hunter-gatherer people all sort of come together. And I think it's sort of interesting to tease those apart a little bit. So one of the things that I think is interesting about the modern psychological model is they sometimes, give lip service a little bit to multi-generational trauma and things that have happened across, a longer lineage than our family of origin. But so in modern society, for a lot of people, we've ended up really engaged with the nuclear family. So it's interesting to compare and contrast this with places in the world where you have these multi-generational households, and there are a lot of ways that people are moving with that and being with that and living with that I just don't have the ability to speak into particularly well. So I want to be clear, I'm not ignoring all these different models of family. It's just that as someone who's practicing in the US, working with people online and over the phone, I have a demographic that is much more likely to have had a parent or two parents, depending on the situation, and had an isolated household. And sometimes I have clients who were raised by grandparents or grandparents were involved, but in general, they weren't living with aunts and uncles and cousins and all under, a big family roof. So when I speak into this, I'm very much aware that this is a particular demographic, and that, as you will see, is important for what I'm going to explore in talking about all of this. So one of the limitations of modern psychology when they're looking at the nuclear family and childhood impacting who we are as adults is I think that they tend to treat babies in some ways as the blank slate, and it puts a lot of pressure on mom and dad because if they get this wrong or that wrong, they could have a child as an adult that struggles with a lot of different things. And my experience is, for sure, our early experiences are impactful. However, there's a lot of impact that I don't believe correlates to those early experiences. Now, they can be activators for deeper wounds that we see from past lives, But the math equation, I don't think quite works out when we try to correlate all of the struggle and pain and difficulty that we have in the contemporary time with events from our family of origin. And I've also seen cases of some of my clients who have survived incredibly horrific things, the kind of childhood where if CPS had known what was going on, Child Protective Services would have taken those children away from those horrifically unqualified adults, to put it in the kindest way possible. And yet, something about this individual's longer relationship to past lives, deep inner resources, has produced a result where they actually came out a lot more functional and solid. And sometimes I work with people who've done a lot of inner work to get there. So there's really no comparison. You could look at the same external event or a very similar one, and the impact could look really different for a lot of different reasons. And one of the things that I think is important to tease out is the thing that I talk about in my Heal Now, Resolve the Past Later podcast. And I just think it's a really good reference where we recognize that there's a lot of opportunity for a dramatic shift in the here and now by understanding and working with our nervous system and our trauma response and some of the hacks we can do with our brain and some modalities for trauma resolution like EMDR or somatic experiencing that sort of recode things. So we don't have to go back and resolve all these complicated themes of past lives and ancestors in order to have a very dramatic improvement in mental and emotional health very, very quickly. There's also the super complicated thing of biochemistry, and some people just navigate wacky biochemistry, then that has its own complex multi-layered impact. So I know I'm giving a lot of caveats here, but my hope is with what I'm sharing here to provide a little bit of a mirror to look into where you can start to understand some things about yourself and be able to move effectively with really good next steps for you on the healing journey. And so when we start to put aside, the family of origin trauma and strengths and the nuclear family, so that is its own category to be explored, and we put aside the impact of hunter-gatherer biology and human animal in a modern person, which if it doesn't get the right adult supervision will cause a lot of mischief, and kind of habits and patterns and strategies that we may have come up with as adult survivors of childhood that just may be a little outdated, may not really fit the current circumstances. So we've taken those rather considerable things and put them to the side. And now we're looking at the impact of past lives and ancestral healing on our contemporary experience. So if we compare our impact of past lives and the impact of our ancestral legacy, which do we want to look at first? If you were going to, go work with someone and get some healing, I do both of those kinds. I do soul retrieval first with my clients because that, in my mind, has a much, much larger impact. But from there's so many levels of sort of cleaning up old energy that we're carrying around that causes complexity and mischief and reactivity and has us stuck in patterns that we might want to move and shift. And so when we look at the legacy from our ancestors, I'm a big fan of doing ancestral healing so that those who've passed on get all their soul parts back, reintegrated with themselves in upper world, and we can clean up left behind energetic structures that are painful and messy, or even the really good ones, just for the sake of not having organized energy. So one of the things I sometimes get asked to do is clear a house where somebody might have lived there very happily and had a long, rich life. But in service to my client, I want the imprint of the people who have gone before to be cleared, even if it was really positive, so that the person has the most space to have their clean, clear experience of the home that they're in. And old buildings are really cool. I'm a big fan. However, if it's going to be your home, I recommend working with it in a really particular way so that you have the biggest canvas on which to work with your life and have your own unique individual experience. So one of the things that can really factor in with what our impact is on our ancestral legacy versus past lives is the soul contract that we made before we came in. So souls tend to have preferences. They have preferences for locations. They have preferences for, what kind of people they want to hang out with, what kind of life they want to create. And so if someone just really specifically likes a particular culture, a particular group of people, they're like the folks of Sweden, they're marvelous. I just love the culture. I love the location. I love the land. And they have many, many lifetimes of incarnating on that land. Then the ancestral legacy of what it is to be in that lineage is going to be a lot more impactful. And then when you start to look at cultures that really carry forward a lot of traditions and some of their shamanic practices, whether they call them that or not, and rhythms of life. And there's a lot of sort of cultural agreement about how people participate. I grew up in a farming kind of agricultural area in Northern California. We had a farm, and there was a really different rhythm to what neighbors expected of each other, how they showed up, how they supported each other, how much they were in everybody else's business. That was different than my San Diego experience, where we might actually physically be living a lot closer, but there's more of an assumption that the people within our sphere of concern are the people that we choose and are a little bit more spread out. And it's not that one is right or wrong, it's just a difference to note. So for people who incarnate into cultures that have really rich spiritual and family and cultural traditions, I may not see them as often as clients if that's something that resonates with them. So it's not that I've never worked with someone of Native American heritage. However, if they're integrated into the culture, they're probably going to go to the shamans in their culture instead of a Caucasian, someone who grew up in middle-class America who's working as a shamanic practitioner. And there's no right or wrong with that. There are a lot of things I bring to the table for people who have similar backgrounds. If you haven't worked in corporate America, you may not understand how to work with the energetics of that in the same way. So none of this is like this is better or worse. It's just noting that there's some particular things about the demographics that I've worked with. When it comes to the soul contract, sometimes people join a particular family for, I like all of these souls. They may have siblings that they agree to come in with. They may have a whole group of people. There may be a grandmother or a grandfather that was a really compelling sell on this particular group of people. But sometimes I see people whose soul contract was 100% with who their mother was going to be. And they just didn't have much soul affinity for dad. He was around, maybe a good provider, maybe not. But this experience where we can look at the members of our family of origin and whether we have soul affinity independent of how healthy they are or they aren't. And when we have that deep soul affinity, as long as there isn't a huge amount of lack of health or problems with communication or really irreconcilable differences, people who have high soul affinity tend to participate much more deeply and consistently with members of their family of origin. And the more people that are really important and significant in that way, the more impactful the ancestral legacy is going to be. Whereas people who maybe didn't have a lot of that relationship, kind of moved out on their own, how impactful a particular lineage is could show up a lot lighter if someone has a different relationship to that. So affinity for any cultural heritage, how many times you've incarnated, which I suppose gets into past lives, but if you have just a real fondness for participating in a particular culture, the ancestral lineage will be more significant. Whether that culture has reverence for ancestors definitely begins to have an impact. And I think it's always good to just do due diligence in terms of some cleaning up in that regard, regardless. That being said, I often find that I end up working more with people who have a past life that needs some attention. So it can be a series of past lives. So, for example, someone who was in the ashram structure of offering their gifts, living a spiritual life in a structured community, may not have handled money very much in their past lives, and therefore might need to build a relationship and the energetic pathways and relationship in this lifetime. And that aspect is an important thing to kind of cultivate some energetic ability to be in right relationship, to be able to work with this stuff where you're not living a life in an ashram. You do have to, make money work out for you. And ideally we work with energy well so that our right action and our efforts in the world are leveraged in a really good way. I also often find, particularly with people who have really done some earnest, committed inner work, and that could look like therapy or breath work or meditation or those kind of things, and there's something that's still really stuck for them, there's often a past life anchor that they weren't able to resolve. Sometimes they weren't able to resolve it because death followed quickly. If I get a client who's in the process of wanting to become pregnant or is pregnant, I always want to clean out any past lives where they lost children or had difficulties in childbirth, because those fears can really, really arise. It's a very primal part of the human experience. And one of the things I celebrate about the modern world is how many women and infants safely make it through that whole process of babies coming into the world. We have a lot of problems in the modern era and a lot of things that if we were getting a report card would be marked needs improvement. But we've done a spectacular job collectively. And I know there's still lots of issues of, the medical model and how it interfaces with pregnancy, but overall, just kind of coming down to that is something that can be really impactful from a past life and is very good to clean up. And there can be overshadowing of romantic relationships. We often go very quickly with someone who we have this deep past life history with, and we don't always have the discernment for whether they're a good contemporary choice because of the depth of experience that can be created by that kind of history. It's easier, sometimes there's someone we just, dislike on sight as a result of this. But overall, what I'm cleaning up is more people who are very, very drawn to someone that isn't a good match. And that's kind of my standard operating procedure of things to clean up. So overall, I'm not saying that ancestors can't be impactful and there aren't specific occasions, but just when I'm in shamanic reality, my client has presented me with a problem that they want some help with, an outcome that they would like to be different, and I'm going to the guides of ancestral healing and past life healing, I'm much, much more likely to be taken to a past life. And I don't go in assuming anything. I just go in with the guides of what healing can we do now that would have the most impact for this person on having the life experience they want, of having the results that they want. And those knots of energy that happen because of things that aren't available to us, we don't even have the information, those can be really, really impactful and a hidden kind of thing. And it's not that we can't resolve past life wounds through working on the issue, in contemporary time. It's a deeper hole to kind of dig ourselves out of when there's a lot of unseen history. And I think that description can apply to ancestral patterns or it can apply to the past life patterns. But my experience is that we tend to just be in a stronger, more consistent relationship with what our soul has engaged with throughout lifetimes than we necessarily are with our lineage of the stories that are handed down, especially because when you go back a few generations, things start to be really diluted. There's, if you have, hundreds of how many ever times great grandparents, the impact of one individual having a lineage that carries down isn't necessarily as impactful. Now, the caveat on that is when you have that sort of magnetic glue of people's issues matching up. So if you have domestic violence here and that person pairs with someone else from a family of domestic violence, and that's happened a lot of times, there can be some really deep anchored addiction, mental illness, domestic violence, many people who, really can't connect with their heart chakra, and a series of heart attacks that run through. And, kind of the both and. I'm not saying that heart attacks are caused by people's energy not flowing properly in the heart chakra, but I would argue compellingly that this surely doesn't help the situation. And those kind of family patterns can be a contributing factor to those kind of outcomes. And in kind of navigating the territory where, people are sort of through either study or osmosis absorbing ideas about shamanism and the things that don't fit with the mainstream. Your parents messed up and these are your wounds, or your parents got it right and this is, why things happen. Again, I'm not saying that isn't impactful and a thing to interrogate and look at, but I think that it is a limited part of the picture as a whole. There are these other factors. And when we start looking at traditional shamanism, past lives, from what I've been taught, aren't really something that you find in indigenous cultures. So unless it's changed, and my information may not be up to date, the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, which I think is a marvelous organization and provides fantastic basic training, doesn't have training on past lives. They work with extraction and psychopomp work, helping souls cross over, and they have all of this training because they're looking at the common threads of ways of doing shamanic healing that show up in indigenous cultures. And this perspective of who you were in other lifetimes and what that means for the journey of your soul just isn't something that necessarily I've found as a big part of that. That being said, we're in such a different environment as modern people. We have so many choices and so many different reasons that we set up an incarnation contract in a particular way. There's so many souls that may have lived a really isolated kind of religious life who now there's enough safety in the world that they feel good about going out and exploring things that they might not have explored before. It's a cool time if you're like, wow, I've never been a parent and I'd like to try that, and my odds of not losing a child are at an all-time low. There's just never been this kind of incarnate opportunity to not have that particular life experience. And, I've certainly worked with people who've lost children, and there's, a lot of intensity to it. But if you go back historically, way, way, way more universal kind of experience than it is for modern people, especially those of us who are living in developed nations. So part of what I think influences this past life being something that for most of my clients, most of the time I see as being more impactful is the part where when we're creating our soul contract and deciding our incarnation path, we are picking from a lot of different factors with a lot more freedom and a lot of opportunity to kind of go off type, to have a different kind of experience than what we might have experienced many times over, because it really worked for us. We enjoyed it. There's a lot of benevolence in the modern era to come in, like really being kind of new to working out the whole money thing and still be okay enough, still have your fundamental survival needs met in a way that Victorian England was not offering to people. So all of this is to say, as I've said, individual results vary. I absolutely am super happy to work with either past lives or ancestors, but if you're sort of looking to well, I've looked at this stuff in therapy and I still have this deep experience. And I've dealt with some of the really contemporary medicine of regulating my nervous system and, engaging in the hacks that help keep my fight or flight from telling me terrible stories about awful things that are going to happen to me and everybody I love. And, we've done kind of that. And there still are these really stuck places, these things that we can't get at. Your own intuition and wisdom about whether that might be an ancestral legacy or that might be a past life impact is very valid. I think that often the things to look at first are things that are anchored in this lifetime, but my guides are very much about, sort of taking the most impactful healing or energetic interventions. So it's one of the cool things about the work I get to do. I have quite a rapport of tools and teams of guides, so I can move in many different directions for healing and working with, very, very stuck, stubborn energy that sometimes shows up for my clients. So anyway, I know this is a lot of generalities, but I just wanted to share some lenses of looking at these aspects. And again, I think for most people that I've worked with, the legacy and the lineage of where you've incarnated before and what you got up to and what your experiences were with that is going to have something that has much more impact on the imprints and the things that you find in your energetic field. And not always in a bad way. There's a lot of people who have a lot of mastery where they can pick up an instrument and, make incredible progress on it. And I would argue that that's, again, in my experience, more likely to be a past life working with music than it is necessarily something that comes down through the lineage. But I'm sure that there are plenty of people who could disagree. I'm not invested in being right about this, but I just wanted to illuminate some things about this experience, hopefully giving you a deeper understanding of all the pieces that may come together to create the experience you have of both gifts and pain and challenges, and open up some avenues to move with those that will be the most aligned and efficient in supporting yourself in your healing and your journey overall. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope there's something in this ramble that's supportive for you. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.